Hi, may I have your attention, please? Hi, good afternoon. Um, we welcome you to the second panel of the ISDS Workshop 2019. I am Harshita Gupta and will be the student discussant for this panel. The theme of the panel is Changing Topographies and Geographies of Land from Effects of Climate Change. Now I would like to introduce the panel to the audience present here. The chair of the panel is Dr. Bhuvneshwari Raman from Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. Dr. Raman is trained in architecture, urban planning, and social sciences. Her research interests are in the areas of transformation of urban land, urban politics, economic geography governance, research methodology, gender and urban poverty. Currently, she is researching about the transformation of land in small towns and large urbanizing villages in South India and the role of new technologies in spatial governance. Now, introducing the panelists, our first panelist is Mr. Nitin Sethi. Mr. Sethi is a senior environment journalist who has contributed as a columnist in several well-reputed national newspapers, including the Business Standard. Our second panelist is Mr. Kumar Sambhav Srivastav. Mr. Srivastav is a Delhi-based journalist. He reports at the intersection of environment, business, politics, and social justice for Scroll.in, which is India's largest fully online news organization. He's also a co-founder of Land Conflict Watch, the first of its kind data journalism project that maps land conflicts in India. Our last panelist is Dr. Swagato Sarkar, professor at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. Dr. Sarkar is an interdisciplinarian who draws from political theory, sociology, and political economy, and also is the founding faculty member and former associate dean of Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. His areas of interest are understanding the state-society relationship in India, politics of land and rural transformation, and theory of power and governance. Now, just going ahead with the format of the panel discussion, which is as follows. The chair will begin the panel with opening remarks on the panel's theme with her thoughts. The time assigned for this is 5 minutes. Each panelist will then be given 15 minutes to speak on any one of the questions mentioned here. The panel's chair will be assisted by a student discussant as well, who will coordinate the question and answer session following panelist statements. The time given for question and answer session is 30 minutes, followed by closing statements from the panelist and the chair. With that, I submit the floor to the chair of the session, Dr. Raman.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I wouldn't take much time in giving the opening remarks. Basically, this is a very topical subject on the effect of climate change on environment, and I come from a discipline of architecture and urban planning, and I've been working with the politics of land. And one of the issues with various disciplines is that either you miss out the interconnections between for example, architecture and planning has always been concerned with the how do you mobilize land for economic activities, and for a long time ecological aspects and environmental effects has sadly been missed out, although this is supposed to be the basic essence of it. And I was also reminded of today's Supreme Court decision on the coastal regulation zone, the judgment on demolition of flats around a lake in Kerala, which is a gross violation of coastal regulation zone. And we are also in a time when land is becoming an intensely contested subject, both in terms of the ways in which agricultural land, forest land, and our water resources are being mobilized for urban development. And it's time that we start discussing the effects of it. And it is in this context, it's a timely panel. And thank you for organizing it. With this, I invite the first discussant, Nitin, to open his talks. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me over. The perils of being a journalist is that you lose your job so often for doing your work that by the time you reach the panel, you've lost your previous job. So neither is he in his job, nor am I in the job that we were introduced to. But that said, so also that both of us have worked together very often, so we're going to do kind of a tango and play together. I thought I'll try and lay out the initial landscape, which he will complement or supplement with some very specific work that he does independently as well as we've done together, and then we'll kind of try and close it together. So hopefully, if we, with the permission of the chair, if we can keep it within the 30 minutes, but play around with each other on that, if you permit that. So we'll stay within the 30 minutes. So though the original idea was, I think in the talk, was to look at how forest governance happens and how therefore it impacts how climate change impacts forests, therefore how it impacts urban areas. I would like to expand that slightly to look at forest agriculture and marginal lands as a continuum. In our traditional sense of how people live with forests, the notion, particularly in the middle class and the upper middle classes, there are people who live inside the forest and people who live in the agrarian lands and people who live in the cities. The true practice actually is that most people who live either on the margins of forests or within forests actually are largely agriculture practitioners, just marginal practitioners of agriculture. Therefore, to look at them in isolation, I don't think it makes sense. The other way I would suggest to look at how urbanization interacts with the rural economy or the forest agrarian economy is to look at how resources flow both in terms of human space as well as material terms, how resources flow and how climate change might impact that, both in terms of direct impact of climate change and the impact of the solutions to climate change that are proffered at this stage, at least globally and domestically. And this, I think, essentially must be seen, and this is how I like to see it, and I'll propose that when you see this, you also need to know what is the general tone of governance or a trajectory of governance when the systems look upon how to manage these spaces. What is without, if you took out the noise of climate change or what that will do to society, and you said, how does government manage these resources at the moment? And when climate change happens on top of this as a layer, add-on layer, then how does governance respond to that? What happens to societies in both these three terrestrial zones in some sense, or even coasts if you want to add to it? My first large trend that we notice at an economic level is that climate change obviously is, and this is a pretty much a tautology, impacting lands on the coasts, does cause greater stress, will turn dry lands into slightly more dry lands, will turn heat waves impact much harder, therefore droughts, agrarian stress would be more erratic and more stronger. But against this and without this, the government in the last 8 to 9 years, maybe even 15 years if you look at data, has moved in a certain fashion which did not exist till, say, the mid-2000s, I would say, where the role of the government to manage resources as far as lands are concerned and compensating people for loss of livelihoods or loss of social security was to provide various services. So the services could be run your midday meal schemes, provide Manrega, or various other programs that the government runs, which generally would be called the social sector schemes. They would, by today, they tantamount to about 3.5 lakh crores being spent annually by the center, another 2.5 lakh crores being spent by the states in addition to this. We must remember states spend more than the center today on most social activities as the economies change. The trend that's visible in the last 10 years is that the state itself has withdrawn from looking at the quality of expenditure and has done this by a simple mode by turning it into cash. What that does is while you're delivering cash to individuals, so it's whether it's a direct benefit scheme, whether it's saying 2,000 rupees to a farmer of any kind now, whatever that does is it permits the state to step back and say the quality of expenditure or how that money is spent becomes a vacuum zone where nobody's monitoring it. Because the goals of that cash transfer are very fungible. One can say you've left it to the farmer to choose what to do with that 2,000 rupees. So whether the farmer, the woman farmer, or the man farmer, what they've used it for, whether they've made sure they're investing in the long-term security of the land, or they're investing in immediate social security, foregoing long-term security, the state's responsibility shrinks the moment you turn into cash. And that's a trend that started in mid of the second UPA term and has exacerbated in the last 5 years. It's a trend that we'll keep on seeing as out of the 3.5 lakh crores, about 1.5 lakh now is transferred as pure cash. In some cases, it makes sense. In a lot of cases, it creates doubtful productivity. Say, maternity benefits, cash being given to maternity benefit schemes, perhaps is more efficient than actually landing, schemes. On the other hand, distributing cash to Punjab and Haryana farmers is a perverse incentive to people who are already making a lot of money out of an ecologically very damaging exercise of practicing rice wheat culture. Now, against this is the second flow, which is the flow from what I think is the forest agriculture continuum to a building urban society. Very simple raw products like at the end for us look like cement. So 70% of India's cement consumption goes into private housing and not large infrastructure, not roads, not bridges, but actually just housing. To aluminium, steel, consumption of therefore energy, coal, and the extraction of these resources from what might traditionally be thought of as forest land, but are really agricultural forest continuum lands that the marginal tribals largely and then other small marginal communities inhabit. What climate change does or does not do is alter the patterns of how this extraction happens. Addressing climate change or understanding the impacts of climate change is very evident that the extraction of these resources does not go down or up. Coal perhaps with a marginal difference, but all other mineral extraction continue at the same level. Therefore, there's a regime that is necessary for this extraction to continue for your urbanization. So if you have a PMAY which says we'll build 5 crore houses a year, there's a certain amount of cement consumption that will happen. Therefore, you will require a certain degree of extraction that will happen in the marginal lands. How do these lands turn marginal? And I think that's where the challenge lies once climate change steps in and its impacts are visible, is that these lands are not marginal because their productivity is low. The lands are marginal because the way you allow citizens to believe it, how much it belongs to them, that operates at the margins of the law. So legally, you can have a regime which says all communities will have rights over their lands in Schedule 5 areas, which are predominantly tribal, or Schedule 6 areas in the northeast. But in practice, that does not happen. Therefore, the kind of stories that perhaps Samba will look at later, and you'll find the exhaustive levels of quasi-legal spaces that are available for government to usurp land and extend its powers over people's lands very easily. When climate change happens, climate change brings a little more stress. Stories of migration will become pretty regular or more intense. The ability for, unlike the notion that largely climate change suggests of there will be dramatic shifts in society, most often actually the shifts are not dramatic. So you will not be able to distinguish between climate-induced migration and pure economic seasonal migration. It's very difficult to find a definition that classifies one from the other. Therefore, you will not be able to see it as a perceived difference in the pulse. It will just be a pulse more intense, which actually might get damped the moment economic activity goes down a little. Say the kind of stuff that Dr. Mehrotra was talking about earlier, if suddenly construction work in Delhi and Bombay disappears, even with existing climate change pulses, you'll find the band is lower simply because there aren't enough jobs happening in construction. If construction happens, you will require more minerals from under the earth, also move them more towards urbanization. This land concern of intensity of resource use from land is also much more visible and more easily manageable and at least observable when you look at water as a resource. Therefore, it's much easier to see. The need for water, both to manage water in a manner which is predictable. So for most agricultural practice and more life purposes, the predictability of water is more important than the volume of water you have. So Kerala can sustain itself at very high levels of water as long as it's predictable. Rajasthan can maintain itself at very low levels of consumption of water as long as there's predictability of that flow. The predictability patterns will shift as climate change happens. The trouble with climate change, and when it steps in, and it is beginning to happen in India, is the solutions to climate change also require water-intensive systems to be put in place. For example, if you take the large solution that does exist technologically, solar. Now, you may not need, for a megawatt of thermal power plant, the amount of water you need only a third of that for solar. But solar is so inefficient as a technology that once you deploy solar, to produce equivalent amount of energy, you'll end up using 3 times the water that the megawatt capacity requires. So roughly, by the time you want to produce, say, 1 gigawatt hour of electricity, the amount of water you'll end up using, whether you use thermal or solar, will be equivalent. Two, solar power plants therefore necessarily will have to come up next to river spaces. So you'll hear histories of conflicts across the country where solar lands, something called solar lands are being created, or solar cells, parks are being created, and they're all next to rivers because extraction of water to heat, cool down the panels is essential. How much land do you need if you were to set up? What is your existing idea of a solar solution which the current government suggested? So current government said somewhere around 100 gigawatts in the next 5-7 years. That roughly requires 14,000 square kilometers of land under solar cells. That will still produce only a third of the energy produced by 100 gigawatts of coal. Therefore, if you want to replace 100 gigawatts of coal, you will have to 3 times do the solar that exists now, which means you'll roughly be at the same level of water consumption that you were 5 years ago. So several of these solutions also require as intensive use of base natural resources as you did without climate change. Two, the other big solution that appears to climate change, and India's partake to it, India, Brazil, Indonesia, the 3 big partakes in this business, is enhanced forestry. One solution to climate change that developing countries particularly love is saying we'll grow more forests, it shall capture more carbon, will not allow carbon to move out into the atmosphere, and that might be one way for us who are not so industrialized to provide a solution to climate change. In turn, rich countries will be able to give us some money for it because this will be cheaper form of carbon mitigation, as it's called. So to give you generally, the higher you are on a per capita basis as a society, higher is the cost per dollar of per unit of carbon to resolve it. The lower you are economically, the cheaper it is for you to resolve it. Also because the great amount of inefficiencies available in your industrial systems, in your society, that you can do at cheaper level. So say a ton of carbon in US would on average cost around $20. In India, it would cost around $0.50 right now to solve. Therefore, the average American government might say, why not give them $1, we save 19 at the same time, let Indians grow more forests. The trouble with growing more forests is you grow not forests, but plantations. Where do you grow plantations? Plantations you grow on lands which are traditionally on our records called wastelands, which are again these marginal, very productive lands, just that they're ambiguous in the terms their ownership is managed. So the moment you find a solution to climate change, you will again have to go back to the same lands, and again I think Sambhav might come back to exact stories where you'll find where plantations, the next round of debate between the government and the tribal communities in India is not just the minerals being taken out, but also what the government believes is the climate change solution is causing the next round of conflicts across the nation. The third and the fourth part, I think, which we, at least us terrestrial idiots sitting up in North India, do not notice, is the conflict that is causes, one, at the coasts, and 3, with the livestock. So again, in agrarian economies, one of the best insurance schemes is always to have livestock. Those who can afford will always have that. That causes easy encashment during times of distress, and otherwise also provides you supplementary income. The percentage of GDP that's been earned from livestock has grown substantially, while that from forestry for India, even if it went only to the government, has reduced over the last 20 years. So livestock in some sense becomes a heart of your agrarian economy. The impact on livestock of induced heat in the body is much more than the humans. Therefore, an average half a degree increase in temperatures, say in the belts of Terai and Upper Terai in the Himalayas, would actually shift your livestock about a kilometer up, which means certain villages which could afford to have a certain kind of livestock at certain point will not be able to, those up in the upper reaches would be. Also, the levels of death that happen in livestock, even in central India where heat levels are already pretty high, are pretty rapid. There are some sample studies now available to show that. The consequences of this on how much cash insurance you have when you're anyway going to feel more distressed by agriculture would be seen through the lens of the livestock, not really changes in agriculture patterns really. So those who will continue to in irrigation plants, irrigated areas grow wheat, rice, might actually continue to do it for the next 15 years. In some areas, wheat productivity might actually increase with climate change. But your livestock would get hit across the board wherever you are. There is no positive gain out of climate change on livestock. The third and the most fascinating bit, and something that we've studied the least, I think, again, because a lot of this work gets happened in North India, is the consequences on all your marine fisheries and all your marine systems. There's a peculiarity to that, which I don't think most of us consider unless we've lived on those belts, is that people who live on marine ecologies do not partake or do not distribute terrestrial spaces to themselves. They distribute coastal spaces and semi-coastal spaces to them. The nature of that, by tradition, has been to have a very ambiguous sense of ownership. There are very few spaces in systems you'll find where coastal communities actually demarcate waters in a physical terms. Also because the fish movements allow a certain degree of fluidity of how you have ownership. Most coastal communities do not look at their lands as assets, therefore have traditionally never assetified, recorded their ownership over lands except where there's coconut to be grown. Most communities which grow coconut look at coconut as asset, not the land that lies under it. In heritage, you give away the coconut tree. Now, when climate change sets in, the first thing you need to do is secure, in some sense, if you're looking for nothing else but compensation, you need to secure what you think is your asset to begin with. How do you, in an Indian legal system, one, secure an ambiguous ocean or a sea? Two, how do you secure a coconut tree? There are no land records. Most of the coasts in India do not have cadastral surveys, which allows complete ambiguity, which is brilliant for a community to actually operate autonomous of the state. Because having a land record allows the state to intervene and charge revenue. Not having that traditionally allowed coastal communities to actually earn more and not pay enough revenues. But when climate change steps in and you say your land is going or getting subsided and you look for compensation, the lack of that record actually turns into a challenge, because then you do not have any space to say, we used to own this asset, and how do you own fisheries? There are large cases happening, particularly across Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where you'll find communities are renegotiating the way they own lands and waters. There are some communities which in the past never had formal land record systems, are now trying to inter-community develop them and then even get them registered. Fifth, and I'll pass it on to Sambhav after this, is urbanization. I don't think is a great challenge as far as climate change is concerned. Urbanization only sees the consequences of climate change. The solutions that are available in urbanized areas to climate change are very simple in technological intervention. They do not require great degree of equity being set into society. You can just actually solarize the entire new city and produce renewable energy up to 40% for household consumption, and you're done with. Largely you're done with. The challenges of climate change always lie in the belts of industrialized zones and the belts of what are called marginal lands. And I think that's where your address needs to be to make sure your cities are more livable. Up to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, University, and thank you, Nitin, for laying the ground so succinctly about how communities transact resources in the larger context of climate change. I'd probably focus, narrow it down to the issue of transactions over resources in forest and over forest, and largely the concept of sustainability and how, in the context of climate change, the lack of sustainability principles in the current forest governance may impact people, ecology, and investment. When it comes to forests, I'll just begin with the most recent, and a lot of this work draws from my work as journalist over the years on forest and related issues, as well as a research-based data journalism project that I have been taking on, which is documenting land conflicts across the country for over past 3 years. So to begin with, in 2018, the government came up with the draft for National Forest Policy. And to just give a brief context of why would government revise a forest policy. So the last forest policy that we have was drafted in 1988, and the new forest, and we need a policy because then when you say what laws, rules, and acts the government will enact, what schemes they will do, will be largely under the umbrella of that policy. They will be guided by that. So the new forest policy will govern all the formulation of new schemes, new laws on forest, and all existing schemes will also have to be aligned by the policy. Now, because the last policy was in 1988, the new policy must be revised to incorporate the new principles also in the forest government that might have come up in the last 30 years. as well as what the government may want to do in future to open windows for it. So that's precisely what you would need a policy for. Now I'll go back to 3 years ago. There's this report that I reported in Hindustan Times. This was in 2015, and there was a leaked document from the government that the central government had communication with the state forest department to allow privatization of forest management in India. So the government had a scheme. They were preparing guidelines for the states to let corporates manage forest, and almost about 40% of India's forest they call degraded forest. So for them, degraded forest is which has a density below a certain limit, but of course they are all part of forest and they are biodiverse rich regions. They wanted to convert them into monoculture plantations to let the timber industry as well as paper industry grow their own captive plantations on these forest areas. Certain provisions that I would like to highlight in these guidelines, the government said that tribal communities would be allowed to access non-timber forest produce only in 10 or 15% of the leased out areas, and they were planning to lease out these large chunks of degraded forests to the private companies. Now the problem was this: the 1988 policy did not allow this. The 1988 forest policy specifically said that all forest-based industries should grow their own. They should access raw material from the timber on trees outside the forest areas. It also specifically said that natural forests need to be protected for their gene pool and for their biodiversity, and should not be given access to the industry. So when the new draft came, it had certain provisions. What it claimed to do is that it said that low quality and low productivity of our natural forest impacts of climate change, human-wildlife conflicts, intensifying water crisis, and the continuously declining investment in the sector is affecting health of the forest, and that's why they need to revise the forest policy. The draft also claims that provisions to increase the carbon sink of forests requires promotion of plantations in the catchment, and also conservation of catchment areas of water bodies, prevent forest fires, promote greenery, all kind of good things that forest management requires to be done, that all this draft was claiming to be doing. But all these were already, government has been running these kind of schemes for so many years, and most of these provisions were also the copy of, the mimic of the 1988 policy, except for one provision, which was this. It said that the degraded forest will now be allowed to for the corporates to grow their captive plantations, and also to access raw material from these forests. So once the policy is revised, there were provisions for also revising the laws that prevent the government from leasing out forests, which is essentially the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 and Indian Forest Act. So there is already a couple of months ago, there was a draft which has been circulated within the state for amending the Indian Forest Act. While it has several draconian provisions against which might affect the access of communities and even criminalizes an entire lot of tribal communities living in forest, it also allows, it has the provision of allowing corporates to lease out forest areas. Now, what could be the implications? It's essentially going back to creating new landlords. When you have these huge chunks of forest leased out to certain corporations or individuals, then it's also curtailing access to forest communities dependent on them. It's also converting biodiverse forest into monoculture plantations, which is again affecting the biodiversity. So when it comes to sustainability principles, I would come to 2 points when that you have to conserve the biodiversity of the forest, which essentially this policy doesn't incorporate when it promotes monoculture plantation, as well as access to forest dwellers over the forest land. And there's been a latest IPCC report which says that one of the cheapest ways of dealing with climate change is providing land rights and securing tenure rights of communities over the forest land, which this forest policy did not cover. In fact, as I mentioned, and maybe Nitin can add to it, that the amendment to the Indian Forest Act takes us back to the colonial era where forests were essentially seen as the commodity owned by the government for resource extraction, and tribal communities were overnight declared encroachers over the forest land. So it becomes, even the new amendment in the Indian Forest Act makes it even more draconian, and then the provisions are more of curtailing the access and freedom of movement of tribals in the forest areas. Forget the implementation of the Forest Right Act, which says that there has been a historical injustice against tribal communities and their traditional rights needs to be recognized. So these provisions, including the Panchayat's extensive schedule areas, where in Schedule 5 areas, there are provisions that communities should have the first say in how their forests are managed and how their forests are governed. There is no provision in the policy or in the new amendments that the government has been proposing to implement or align them with the provisions of the Forest Right or Panchayat Extension Schedule Areas Act. It also doesn't, the new forest policy and the new schemes also do not address the implications of increased forest diversion. The data shows that over the years, there has been an increase in the diversion of forest areas for industrial and development projects, while there is a proper process laid out and democratic process, transparent process laid out that this is how forests should be diverted for other uses. From our work on Land Conflict Watch, which I'll come to later, it's quite clear that in several cases, the provisions like seeking consent of the communities which are living on these forests are violated. There have been instances where documents have been forged, where signatures of different panchayats, different communities have been taken and shown that the consent has been taken, while there has been conflicts going on the ground where communities are fighting to not let that land go away. It also doesn't address the incompetence of the forest development corporations. While yes, growing population and demand for timber and urbanization need a lot of timber in India, there are assigned bodies of the forest department which are supposed to do production forestry, but there has been serious allegations of inefficiency of these corporations and lack of sustainable production of timber by these corporations, which are essentially the responsibility of the government to do for production forestry, and that's in fact used as an excuse to argue for the privatization of the forest management. It also says a little about the improving government's forest management practices, again both in terms of sustainability, increasing the biodiversity, conserving biodiversity, or both production forestry equally. Then what could be the in the larger context of development and climate change, what these lack of sustainability principles as well as mismanagement of governance could be causing? There's something, some of the results or maybe causal effect comes out from the work that we have been doing on this data research project. This is Land Conflict Watch. We have been documenting ongoing land conflict cases from across the country for past 3 years. We have a network of researchers and journalists spread across the country who document ongoing land conflict cases from their regions. And this is done through a methodology developed in consultation with academicians, and there is an online system on which the data is filed. So we have about, correct. So so there is a standard form which needs to be filled for each case of land conflict, and by land conflict here we mean any situation where there is a conflicting claim or demand over the ownership, access, or use of land, and where one party is community, and by community we mean a number of families and are part of public. So we are not, so this is not related to property disputes between two individuals or two private parties, but wherever communities are involved. And these cases have to be in a way documented already in an audio-visual or written format. So if there is a news report, if there is a court case, if there is an FIR, or even a resolution passed by a Gram Sabha, so from anywhere between Gram Sabha level to the Supreme Court level, there is a written or audiovisual document. Then from there, we start documenting these cases further. This form needs to be filled by each researcher, and each data point has to be verified and supported by documents. And then all of that is verified and reviewed by reviewers. And after that, each case is published. So we have already documented about 714 cases of land conflicts in past 3 years. They together affect 20 lakh hectare of land, about 65 lakh people, and investment worth rupees 13 lakh crores are linked to these conflicts. Of these 279, about 40% of the total cases are involving forest land. So almost, 40% of these cases do fall somewhere around the peripheries of forest land. They affect 30 lakh people, which is about 52% of the total conflict affected population, and 6 lakh crore of investment is linked to them, which is 46% of the total conflict affected investment. Now, further, if we look at the conflicts in the left-wing extremism affected areas, which has been traditionally linked to land alienation of tribal communities, the violence there, and we looked at data, and it does come out that while just 12% of the districts of the country are affected by left-wing extremism officially, they are site of 17% of the total conflict that we have documented so far from across the country, and 15% of people impacted by conflict, and 31% of the investment affected by these by total land conflicts. Similarly, the Schedule 5 areas, which are designated for special provisions for protection of tribals and their well-being, those are again, while the area is just 13.6% districts of the country, they are site of 26% of the conflicts, and 28.5% of all land conflict affected people are from Schedule 5 areas. Similarly, area is much higher. So which clearly shows that the land conflicts in Schedule 5 areas plus left-wing affected areas, the intensity and impact is much higher there as compared to the area and people they cover. So yeah, I'll stop here and then maybe open to discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and so I'll just, I will reinterpret the question which was given to me, and what I will try to argue or understand is whether you can have a stable land use policy, because that's what it seems to me is at stake here, that how do we create a policy around it, and is a sustainable land use policy possible, whether it's pertaining to the agricultural land or mining areas, forest, etc., etc. I think if we take, and that's where I want to broaden the scope of this this question and try to understand the entanglement of land into two things. One is the formation of empire historically, and its entanglement with capitalism. So if you see the relationship between the land and empire is obviously, these are linked, and the way empires have expanded and stabilized is through the production of new sites by introducing newer agricultural form, which is settled agriculture, and along with that to stabilize these zones or the regions which the emperors have conquered is to bring a new religion. And when these areas get stabilized, then the production process gets normalized in these zones, then land becomes territory, and it returns as a political question. And this is something, if you look into the Eastern India, that has been the case for a very long time. David Ludden's work tells us that how the spread of Islam in the Brahmaputra Ganga basin area, which is earlier there wasn't such demarcated area called Bengal or Assam or any of those, but if you look into that's how Islam and settled agriculture had spread over that entire stretch of area, right up to the Burma border. So when this question becomes returns as, and when the economic process and the agriculture settles down and become normalized, when it returns as a political question, it becomes a question of territory, belonging, and domicile. And then the question becomes of legality, that who has legal right to stay in that particular territory and who is an outsider and so on. And what we find is that it creates this frontier, which these processes, the empire formation processes, creates the weak frontiers, which then comes back as areas where you get massively a genocidal xenophobic politics, whether it's in Assam, whether it's in the Rohingya, in the Arakan's, and so on. And then the partition of Bengal itself is a state test case of this process. So that's one where the land question becomes entangled with the question of citizenship, of belonging, etc., identity, and then the question of historical revenge and reversal of that, where obviously it cannot go back anywhere because it's entangled into that process. And in that process, the other entanglement that land has is historically is with the capitalism, and which is also a part of that empire formation process, is that once the empire captures land, then it also develops various sorts of enclaves of production. So one of that would be the industrial centers, and then and plantations, and then extraction sites, mines, forestry, fishing zones, and then various kind of logistics which come up, ports, airports, etc. And then to the sites of consumption and accumulation, which are the urban spaces. So what happens within this entanglement is that the question that we raised, that whether it is possible to think about a stable or a sustainable land use policy which stabilizes and takes care of our concern that we have, which it seems to me, and that is my argument, that it's impossible to have, when it comes to land, it's impossible to have some kind of a stable or sustainable policy. It's precisely because of this debate between, or the battle between the political economy and the normative policy debate which we can have around sustainability, etc., etc. And what we have found historically is that those normative policy debates have always been subverted by the dynamics of the political economy. So it's always a case, therefore, is of speed of change and the scale of the impact of that. It never manages to quite, the policy never manages to capture this process within the institutional domains. Institutions can only, as we know from the work of Douglas North and others, that it can only create certain constraints, but it also creates opportunities. And capitalism and this desire for a very stable institutional domain within which you can capture this process is something isn't a liberal fantasy which has been going on for a very long time, right from Weber's time. Max Weber himself had that idea that the changes that modernity brings, you can have a bureaucratic form to organize and control that space. So one particular old bearded man in the British Library a long time back found that this is an impossible thing because there's something called capitalism which extremely dynamic and unstable, therefore it is powerful. And surprisingly, that old man's insight has found to be valid through the last 150 years. And as you might have found right now, that bearded men seem to be very insightful. Where we are with this policy, if the debate that if it is impossible to, that capitalism is something which continuously will undo, so would the empire formation. Just because we haven't, democracy doesn't mean that the shahs and the emperors go away. They come back in various forms, and within the democracy, they play a certain role in the formation and capturing and reorganizing these spaces when it looks like a public policy project. But it's actually part of that similar kind of logics which play out. So what has happened, the third thing which has brought these changes along with capitalism and the empire formation is obviously the climate change throughout the history. And along with the diseases. because that has been the history of the North America and Latin America, the kind of diseases which the Europeans brought that completely wiped out the indigenous populations in those areas. You also have the climate change, which certainly brings a change, maybe not sudden in a historic frame, it might look a sudden change, say something like Harappan civilization, which collapses due to the climate change, which within the short period with the salinity of soil and so on, all of that. So perhaps we are at that juncture again, where you not only have the clash of the empire and the capitalism dynamics, but also the climate change, which is right on the horizon, seeming to be posing a threat to the use of the land and the kind of formations that is, the social formations around that. And if that seems like an extreme case, then what we have always discussed, and that's where we are caught into certain kind of problematization, which we try to think within that and we try to get out of it. So one of that is the various kind of resistances to it. We think that the resistance to primitive accumulation and eviction will somehow slow down this process and we'll have control over it. Earlier, that used to be an idea that land reform would be able to do that because it will create a democratic base of ownership, and through that people will control. And then the third thing seems to be the sustainability, which never has managed to gain control. It continuously slips apart. So to put it in the analytical frame, then where is the problem? The problem is the problem that on the changing nature of capitalism. So what has happened is that capitalism, whenever it has through primitive accumulation or any of those things, it has always relied on its outside, whether it's for the nature or the human beings, where it captures and converts into a commodification process through which it gets these resources continuously into that capitalist production process. And then the second thing is to be able to use those into the production process and create certain products through which it creates values and creates the surplus value and which it captures. And so what you get is the three things, is that you have proprietary rights without creating monopolies or capturing surplus value within the production process, or you capture the margin in the trade that happens within that. Now, capitalism of that kind, where capitalism earns through the expanded through the expanded reproduction of capital, that seems to be going away. Capitalism has changed over the last 50 years or so, where it is continuously looking outside those circuits. And one of that is obviously the development of the finance capital, and which David Harvey and others called the accumulation by disposition, because accumulation by the normal expanded reproduction of capital, that is almost impossible or not satisfactory enough for the capital. The appreciation which happens outside is always more lucrative. So what has happened, what we have found even in our work on the Sonipat, the kind of changes which is happening here and the way the farmers are realigning with this, is the split into the way people materially interact with land. Is that at one level it's the means of production, which is part of the production process, but it's also, in Sonipat, it's also a financial asset. So farmers have to grapple with the both, that you have means of production and how that you can use and how you can earn, but also at that financial asset. If the real estate market, urbanization, etc. happens, then how am I going to capture the value which gets enhanced into that process? So, and therefore you speculate onto it. So people are drawn. It's not only the financial capitalism which develops in the New York stock market or the Bombay stock market or elsewhere, but it's also how they come and entangle the very people who own some of these properties and the communities which own it. But the problem, as we know also from the work of David Harvey and the urban theorist, is that the problem with the land and capital is that when capital comes and invests in this property and the land, then it takes a long gestation period to realize that profit. And what it does is that you can lead to certain kind of destruction of the nature immediately, but you don't know how to put that into use. And what we have seen, therefore, all over India, suspended urbanization, suspended power projects, hydro projects. The land has been acquired but has not been able to put into that process. Because these are the two different circuits within which capital is moving, and without bringing those normal process in which capitalism earns its profit and this speculative dimension, unless those two things are brought together, capitalism cannot obviously use those properties. So it acquires those property, it invests, and then it doesn't know what to do with that. And there's a particular character to the Indian capitalism, therefore, because if you look into the Western capital, increasingly Chinese are moving in that direction, is that you take a position over the innovation and the intellectual properties. You earned your profit through that. You create certain, or you earn rent through that. Whereas the Indian capitalism historically has been weak in innovation and creating intellectual properties. What it does is very good at, and therefore is political in nature or dependent on the state, is to take a proprietary control over the physical assets. And that precisely what has happened over all these acquisitions that we see around us. That it's, everybody is interested in getting the land and acquiring it, and then not knowing what to do with that. So there is this entire plan around what we recently studied, this KMP Expressway. So if you look around this process, it took about 30 years finally to complete this land. But there is this whole plan of industrialization. So various parts have been taken. There are 4 industrial model township which are supposed to come up. Right here, there's something called Kharkhoda, where if you go, the land has been taken, fertile land, completely destroyed. Now all that stands is grass, nothing else, no industry. So we need to understand this capitalism and how it has changed and what it is trying to do. What we also know, and perhaps that the 13,000 crore that Kumar talked about, perhaps it's also important that where is this money coming from and where is it going? Most of that money, as we also know, are what this land assets are creating, this final land being converted into, or space being converted into financial assets, is that it's absorbing enormous amount of the capital which is available otherwise in the market or in the economy, and converting it into, and getting locked into that. And that money, most of the time, the source are the public fund, and that's where the NPA, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the NPA's, the largest contribution is this various kind of projects around the resources. I think almost, I read somewhere about 60% to 70% of the NPA, or at least 50% of NPA is due to all of these suspended projects where it has got 80%. Yeah, so 80% of NPA is. So that tells us about the kind of change that we are doing here, we're witnessing, and the kind of conflicts which is going on is also because everybody is interested in taking the proprietary control. And that's where, therefore, the conflict over. And I think once you look into, put this question into this political economic framework and the kind of capitalism that we have and what is happening, then it's almost impossible to think about any of those kind of sustainable policy or SDGs and all the nice things that exist in the world, because the only thing then it remains is the politics, is the conflict which will take its another shape. And there I'll end with by going back to where I began this, when we look into the social and political formations, the two impulses are the empire formations and the capitalism which joins later on. And what the political scientist Sudipta Kaviraj tells us, that if you look into the history of the Indian state, this is the two logics which have always worked in tandem, is the empire formation, and where empires have all of a sudden lost itself is the regional assertion. So I think that's where we are coming to this, that will this be the regional forces which will undo this process? But that's where you also need to then problematize here, which is almost outside our scope, is the question of nationalism and what kind of nationalism it comes, what kind of regional identities are there, whether people can organize into this idea of not only community which is village level, but at a regional level which has always confronted the empire building in India, and therefore India never had, so to speak, the Akhand Bharat. So if Akhand Bharat comes in, then how this battle are going to be fault lines. So I think the fault lines are apparent through the land, and it will be interesting to see. I'm not very hopeful. Thank you.